Friends, welcome back to Ground Game. We've got episode 2 with Diane Goldstein, the Executive Director of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. This is an incredibly fun episode for me to do. As you'll hear, Diane and I go way back. She is truly an OG of OGs in progressive drug policy reform and stands at so many different intersections within the field war on drugs, especially from a law enforcement perspective and a community perspective. So really hope you enjoy this episode. I really enjoyed putting it together. And as always, if you enjoy these podcasts, if you've got feedback, ideas for different guests, criticisms, it's all welcome here. Don't hesitate to reach out. You can find me at sam@cpppolicy.org. Just shoot me an email, and just really excited to be doing this podcast and getting back into the space where I get to facilitate juicy conversations about all of the opportunities and challenges that are ahead here in terms of creating psychedelic access for people who stand to benefit, especially at the state level. Diane, welcome to Ground Game. Man, we've known each other for like at least 15 years at this point, right? I've been wanting to have you on for a while.
2010, Sam. So like,
wow, I was still in college.
So think about this. We're OGs. Right. And
that's right.
And almost when you look at the arc of drug policy reform, we are people who have seen this transformation of drug policy, but also have some cynicism and some some skeptical looks at how this works and how we manage and why we engaged in this work, which is about making people's lives better in the moment and reducing the harms of the criminal justice system and the really horrific interventions that the war on drugs has failed. And whether it's psychedelics or cannabis or anything else is, advocates and capitalism have changed the work.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, there's so much I want to get into with you today. Really excited to have you here. Your career, the work that LEAP is doing, where psychedelic access is going. Let's get into all of it. And so I want to jump right in here. So first and foremost, you spent 21 years in law enforcement. Is that correct?
Almost.
And you retired as Redondo Beach's first female lieutenant. You supervised narcotics. You helped write California's crisis negotiation playbook. Give listeners a little bit of a nutshell. How does someone with that resume end up being, the executive director of running the largest organization for former law enforcement officers fighting the failed war on drugs? How does that happen?
Personal and professional storytelling and its nexus. So I started my career in 1983 because I'm old. I'll be 65 this year. I hate to say this. I just got approved for
You're crushing it. You're crushing
for Medicare Part A and Part B. Got my notice yesterday. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm turning 65, right? And I retired against my will because I was medically retired in 2004. And what I always had was running parallel paths in my professional and my personal life. So I saw the failures of our drug control strategies because of my brother. And so for most folks that don't understand is I had a brother who was criminal justice impacted. And because of my help is he ended up getting a deal of his lifetime and then became a person in recovery for 20 years up until he lost his job, lost his access to his healthcare, his psychiatrist, his therapist, his medication, and then started spinning out the system again because he was both bipolar and suffered from substance use disorder. And so at the same time with all of this, I'm also an active duty police officer, right? And I fell into policing simply because I was cocktail waitressing and food waitressing. And from 18 to 21, and I wanted to be an attorney, but the place where I worked, tons and tons of cops came in, and I went on a ride along and went, oh my gosh, you guys get paid for this, right? And it was supposed to be a part-time gig for me, but no different than how I'm the executive director of LEAP. It was all a pivot change at a moment that was really critically important to me. And so for the longstanding work in policing, I started a school resource officer program that was based on wraparound services and keeping kids out of the school to prison pipeline. And I was the second female sergeant, and I ran a multi-agency surveillance team that did everything from dismantled meth labs back in the days when we had all the pop-up meth labs before drug prohibition sent it all to Mexico, right?
Right.
And I saw the absolute failure. I worked sex crimes, I worked gangs, everything I did reflected that the drug war and our enforcement of our drug laws actually did nothing to change consumers who wanted access to unregulated drugs. It didn't change the behavior of law enforcement. It didn't stop crime, but what it did was cause death, disease, and addiction. And then it absolutely ruined the relationship that law enforcement had with the communities they're supposed to serve as peace officers rather than mindlessly policing people. And so I would never change my career. I fell into policing. It was incredible. It was impactful. I made a significant difference in people's lives, gang members' lives, getting people out of gangs, finding people jobs, preventing, violent crimes on my campus because kids trusted me, because the community trusted me. And what I always saw was this tendency from legislators in particular to take big crime events. I used to call it the crime du jour, Sam. I was through 22 years of the crime du jour where the pendulum just swung and we overreacted to an outlier incident rather than trying to figure out that the community at its core is the boss of law enforcement. And what we have done through legislative practices and political practices is we have used law enforcement from a top-down way and pushed out the very people that deserve to be stakeholders at the table to design effective community health and public safety strategies that would do more to save people's lives and keep people out of very expensive jails and prisons. For folks that don't know where Redondo Beach is in Southern California. And currently today in California, in order to house a single person in custody in Department of Corrections, it costs close to $140,000 a year. That is a living wage, mind you.
Yeah.
That is, if we think about why do we wait so long to invest in the better, more fiscally sound systems of care and say policing and our criminal strategies, whether it's crime prevention or actually going after people who are harming people? Why do we wait until it happens instead of investing the money more appropriately and then saving cops to do cop stuff, right? We don't want to go to mental health calls. We don't want to go to substance use disorder overdoses. We don't want to respond to homeless people because we can't solve that problem, Sam.
Right.
So death of my brother, my policing experience got me in 2010 to a debate during the Proposition 19 campaign in Southern California where Judge Jim Gray was debating the Garden Grove police chief on Proposition 19. Sat in the audience, went up, introduced myself, and said, I've always believed this, and this is who I am. He called Shailene Title and says, hey, I got this retired female lieutenant. And Neil Franklin happened to be in town. Shailene called me, set up a meeting with Neil Franklin, and I got brought into the Proposition 19 campaign in October, a month before the election, and had trial by fire. You are now involved.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're probably doing 10 interviewers a day.
Exactly.
At that point, right?
it was like trial by fire. Here you go.
Yeah.
And completely changed my life and set me on this course where I got hired to be the executive director because of Neil Franklin, who was probably one of the most brilliant visionaries in regards to policing, public health, and drug policy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, give us a little bit of a primer on LEAP. You know, what is LEAP? What does the day-to-day look like, and what are you focused on right now?
So, Law Enforcement Action Partnership started in 2002 as a single policy nonprofit. We had 4 American retired police officers, 1 active duty Canadian police officer, and we were called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. And they literally felt that the failures of the drug war were the worst policy in American governance and policing, second only to slavery. And so we were back then considered the crazy cops, right? It's like the outliers. What do you mean there's cops that are standing in with legislative staff and on the steps of courthouses declaring the drug war a failure and that they want to legalize and regulate all drugs? So in 2000,
I still have my first shirt
right?
That says on the back, "Cops say legalize drugs, ask me why." It's still one of my favorite t-shirts ever.
Howard.
It's probably 15 years old now, but yeah.
Howard Woolridge, right?
That's right.
One of the founders, right? And it was very provocative. But on the other hand, is being against something only gets you so far. And so Neil Franklin and his brilliance, we were at a really critical spot, and I was on the board of directors then because I was the board chair also. About a year later, came to the board and said, we have all these backdoor partners that are current criminal justice professionals because we don't have just retired and former. We have current, former, and retired criminal justice professionals. We have active duty police chiefs. We have active duty judges. We have active duty district attorneys who belong to our organization. But back then, they couldn't say those bad words, legalize drugs, right? It was like backdoor partnerships that all of us had cultivated, but Neil in particular, who recognized that we had all these folks who agreed with us, but couldn't say the words. So we rebranded in 2017 to Law Enforcement Action Partnership. And because of that, we broke down the pillars of work to look at how drug policy impacts police accountability and transparency, how it impacts mass incarceration, how it impacts harm reduction, how it impacts the destruction of the relationship between us and the communities we served. So still today, is drug policy is always going to be, our heart and soul. It is, we have got to end the failure of the drug war. But it also has allowed us to become very innovative and look at the totality of the criminal justice system and say, how do we make the system work for the people we serve? And I think that's what separates us from a lot of other organizations that tend to be the only people who know anything about public safety are the cops and the DAs and the judges, where our response is in a true democracy. And if we are talking about social responsibility towards each other, I don't care who the stakeholder is, whether it's a small business owner or a homeless person, everyone has the right to have input into the policing system and the criminal justice system and to try to provide solutions where we are not siloed away from everyone, but we are a healthy part, maybe not as a first responder, but as the right responder to societal issues. Because I'll tell you, is legislators and policymakers, whether they're state, local, or federal, think that a law is going to solve a socioeconomic issue rather than
less and less these days, almost.
Right? But it's true. And so, I always, caution policymakers and staffers is that laws, no matter how benign, is that they need to understand whether it's a red zone next to a school when a parent is dropping off a kid or something maybe, outside of murder, rape, burglary, like real crimes, right? Is that there's an unintended consequence that if you send cops out to solve a socioeconomic issue, a mentally ill person, someone who suffered a substance abuse or is homeless, and someone doesn't comply, you're giving me as a cop the right up to and including the use of deadly force to get someone to comply. I have these libertarian tendencies sometimes that I think voluntary compliance is the first step to social order. So how do we ensure regulations that contribute to whether it's a cannabis or psychedelics or some other, nicotine, e-vapes, alcohol? There's also like, we want people to voluntarily comply with the law, but we have to set standards that protect consumers and don't create barriers into capitalism, that don't create more barriers that are more harmful than they are beneficial.
Yeah. I mean, the amount of intersections that you and Leap and everyone associated with stand in simultaneously on what feels like multiple dimensions is incredible, to say the least. And I'm curious to kind of to dive into one of those lanes, and specifically the psychedelics. And I'm curious to hear from you about how the conversation around psychedelics has kind of started to, where it started and maybe where it's evolved within the law enforcement community. I mean, most psychedelic advocates, one, have never sat across the table from a narcotics officer. And as someone who was that officer, I mean, what does the average law enforcement, officer think about psychedelics, psilocybin or MDMA? I mean, is there a generational split? Is there a regional difference? Like, how is the conversation around psychedelics been evolving since you have gotten into the advocacy side of things?
It depends, right? And so I think this is the really interesting intersection of this work, because when I sit down and talk to law enforcement leaders who may be afraid, right? So let's think about this. And I know you've heard me discuss this story, and I'll just call the DEA the no fun police. 1983, like, I'm the height of the drug war, 1983 to 2004. 1983, MDMA was unregulated, right? And I can't remember, was it Bayer, one of the German pharmaceuticals, found MDMA in 1912. And we had incredible therapists like Rick Doblin and all sorts of other people that were actively using MDMA in an unregulated, that was legally unregulated. So it's not legal, it's not illegal. And they were using it very successfully to treat people's trauma, or, from a therapeutic standpoint, marriage, family counseling. And it was great. No issues, no problems. And then somebody, because it was unregulated, said, oh my God, MDMA is the fun drug. This is the love drug. It's right. And then we got into, we're going to make money off of it. And then ecstasy was created. And then in 1985, we had 2 kids at a rave who died from the ecstasy, but from being dehydrated. Which again goes back down to consumer protection, standards, safety, education, drug testing, right? All those things. 1983, 1985, emergency scheduled 1986, and MDMA was illegal. No research allowed, because
certainly no education.
No education, no research, no education. And so I look at that, and there's a clear lack of education. Bringing it back to, what do cops think? They don't know what to think because they've never been properly educated. We have used political ideology to educate law enforcement on the issues of drugs that have been filled with stigma and tropes about who people are who use drugs. And I've written about this. Stigmatizing terms, horrible. And I saw it from within my own organization and other law enforcement organizations. There was a point in time that I belonged to the California Narcotics Officers Association, and I think back on it and go, oh my God, if I look at the training that they did, and what I know is education has got to be not just for the public, but for law enforcement to understand what drugs do. We think we know. It's like, oh, heroin's been illegal forever, but they don't know that in Switzerland, heroin assisted treatment programs have been used very effectively for years and has reduced crime, welfare, integrated families back to each other. And so it's
Right.
always about how we label drugs, the good drugs, the bad drugs, which then results in labeling people. And
Right.
except for the war on drugs is not a war on drugs. And you know, from your SSDP days, I'm just throwing out the line. It's a war on
Yeah.
us. My brother
Right.
died because of the war on drugs. And how many other families have been impacted in that fashion, whether their loved one has gone to prison because we didn't use the right tools to manage a public health issue?
Yeah. I mean, this is really bringing up for me a lot of the work that you and so many others have done on dismantling stigma on both sides of the spectrum. And I'll speak a little bit to more what I mean. I mean, on one end, the stigma that, I think from a public or rather a drug user's perspective is that, cops don't want to be educated and they don't care and they just want to bust people. Right. And like, sure, there might be some cops that take that, but it's not all of them. And I learned that when I was at the University of Oregon, freshly after going to my first SSDP conference in Maryland and coming back and learning about LEAP. And I held the first ever, but was certainly not the last, educational seminar on what happens when you mix MDMA and alcohol together,
right,
with the Eugene Police Department,
right,
because they were the first responders and they actually learned some things too, which is that one, like hydration, when you're mixing those two things you can overdose on water.
That's right.
When you mix too much alcohol and MDMA together. Right. And, of course, whether parents liked it or not, the truth was their kids were mixing MDMA and alcohol every single weekend. That's on right. campus. Right. And it felt like a very necessary educational training. It's like, let's bring together the spectrum, the students who don't know that and the law enforcement who doesn't know it. And let's see if we can break down some of that stigma. And I'll tell you, I think we had 200 people show up on like a 10-day notice for that. And law enforcement showed up and they were super cool. And it was one of the most formative experiences in my early on in my drug policy career to see both ends of the spectrum that otherwise from the outside were pitted against each other.
And continue
and to be able to bring up something. Right. Yes, exactly. Exactly.
And yeah. Sam, that is like, I remember that even though I didn't attend, I remember that this was done. And I remember the value of SSDP as partners in this advocacy work and the importance of it. And I would suggest to you that, everything from political ideology that continues to pit people against each other and what I know, right, is trauma. Like there's the fun, but yet there's the trauma that's associated with a lot of this work that we do. And we can talk about psychedelics. And this is like my big main pitch to law enforcement leaders and criminal justice professionals is like, look, you have an obligation to your constituents to send out the best police officers who have not been traumatized and are going to engage in behavior because they've been triggered by their own trauma, right? And so what we know from law enforcement, I've had way too many friends that have killed themselves. I had a really good friend of mine who was the undercover agent at Waco, Texas, and he ended up killing himself on his boss's desk in the LA field office of the ATF because he had like the trauma associated with how the ATF had treated him, how the public had treated him, right? That's not the only story I have like that. I have a young kid who worked for me, who was really a sharp kid and then went to another police agency, was having a lot of struggles. He killed himself, and the next day his wife killed herself, right? And so we talk sometimes a good game from a harm reduction and meeting people where they're at. But frankly, we hold law enforcement to a different standard, and we don't humanize law enforcement. And I'm not suggesting to you that I am discounting any of the harms that bad policing has caused throughout the years. Like, this is why I love my organization, is that we call out bad policing and the reasons that people need to be held accountable. But I will tell you is there's people hang on to their trauma, and cops in particular are afraid to go to their bosses to say, I need mental health help. And so
they might lose their job first and foremost.
They're going to lose their job.
Right? There's serious challenges with being truthful about your mental health in many professions. But if I had to guess, law enforcement and, maybe up there with like airplane pilots are some of the ones that like you immediately are under circumcision for continuing to do that work. Is that right?
Yeah, we take your gun, we put you on administrative leave, we send you to psychiatrists, you have to have fitness for duties, we become afraid, right? And so what happens is then I can't remember the stat. I just saw it. Sarco has it. It is, like the average amount of trauma that I hate to say this, normal people, because right, is the general population experiences is, really much lower unless you're living in, you've been victimized. This is just averages. But, cops in a career see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of incredibly traumatic events. We have to go do death notifications to people. I cannot begin to tell you how many times I've had to knock on people's door to do a death notification and have had to help someone and their family to understand that their loved one just got taken away. Seeing kids molested, being involved in shootings, we had one of our officers that ended up retiring. We had a doctor who killed his kids and himself and left his ex-wife alive. And I remember the picture of one of my officers that the Daily Breeze caught, and it made the front page news because it was such a significant homicide, that he was white and he is helping the coroners carry out this baby that's in a baby body bag. And he ended up becoming an alcoholic and ended up retiring because of that, and then ended up, going back and becoming a therapist to deal with his own trauma. So our ability to ask for help has so many barriers. So people are afraid. And then what does that result in? Alcoholism, suicide, spillover, domestic violence at home, or worse, like it's all bad. But then we take people that we're supposed to serve who may be innocent and don't even recognize what happens. And something bad happens. And then we like there's this, rinse and repeat cycle that no one wants to stop. And psychedelics and mental health destigmatization and research and all the schizophrenic drug policy work that we're currently engaged in right now, because that's what it is,
right,
does have the ability to save people's lives, because we need the best first responders out there who know how to deal with their mental health and can, say, ollie, ollie, oxen, I need a break, and not be punished for recognizing that they've been traumatized by an event. So I got my job. So I was like the last on the police list because, we have these real strict parameters that how long a hiring list can be kept. And the only reason I got hired was one of the officers who had made it through training got sent to a SIDS day. And he had just had a baby. And he literally walked out of that SIDS death investigation and walked in and resigned and said, I can't do this. I'm totally incapable of dealing with this type of trauma.
Right.
And so maybe if we would have had the right resources for him, because he was, everyone that I talked to said he was absolutely what you want in a peace officer and someone who wants to serve your community. So I never forgot that.
Yeah. I mean, I think when we think about reforming these laws and creating, broader access for folks who stand to benefit, veterans in general are kind of have been, and to a certain degree are still more or less the tip of the spear in terms of one of the most influential spokespeople. I would argue that law enforcement can be just as, if not uniquely in its own way, even more powerful within the right audiences, the right context. What roles has LEAP and its speakers bureau played, in recent reform efforts over the last couple of years as it relates to psychedelics? I'm curious if you could give us some examples, and where is LEAP uniquely positioned to help advance, access, not just for, law enforcement, but I think there's a lot of people right behind law enforcement that stand to benefit from a law enforcement forward type of advocacy. So I'm curious if you could give us some examples of work that you've been doing over the past couple of years that has really centered law enforcement as a way to break through some of those stigmatized barriers, not just for law enforcement, but for everyone to a certain degree. I'm kind of curious if you could dig into that a little bit for us.
I think that, I think about the psychedelic and the psychedelic research work, and you're right. I think veterans have been the tip of the spear, and I have centered LEAP's advocacy to be very respectful of veterans' trauma and why they are critically at the tip of the spear. Hang on a minute. My computer's about to die and I need to plug it in.
Yeah, no worries.
And, but law enforcement trauma is, thank goodness we don't have the, what's now 22 to 40 a day, because how many, suicides are actually classified as accidental overdoses. That's my brother's death was like that. I think it was a accidental suicide. Like that was his intent, but he was too scared to really do it. And then, is drank and used heroin and other psychotropic meds that caused his overdose, right? But it was labeled as an overdose and not a suicide. And I, to this day, will tell you that it was a suicide, right? And so, but cops have a lot of the same trauma in different ways, right? And back to humanizing, right? Is LEAP has done an incredible job because of the advocacy space where we have filled, where we've bridged the gap between communities, legislators, and a lot of active duty professionals, that we can present a human version of law enforcement and why this matters. And so we have been involved in legislative work across the country. We've been involved in this work at the international level. We presented at in Vienna at the Commission on Narcotics Drugs. We are leading the way because I think in almost every single state level, either pilot project bill or the working groups, there has been someone from my organization that has worked in that. And so we recognize the importance of the work. I do a lot of collaboration with the veterans at the federal level, and it's about extending public education campaigns on why having the best law enforcement and what it means to a community. So I've engaged with organizations that are, other law enforcement organizations that may not necessarily think about the message, that they're still kind of grounded in the prohibition, but then you really start talking to them and you go, oh, wow, this matters. And how I'm selling it is, in many aspects, is, when you sit down and talk to leaders or policymakers, is how many active duty folks I know who have taken journeys that their chiefs don't know.
Right.
It's like, I mean, this is like, people don't understand. Cops are really innovative and forward thinking and know how to get around rules sometimes, right? It's like, well, if I want to keep my job, I recognize I have this issue. And there's all sorts of groups that have developed that are veteran and first responder affinity groups that are sending cops on journeys in and out of the country now to help them, save them, whether they're retired or active duty. And so, Oregon and you can probably update me on Oregon and on Colorado. I know I've seen lots of different law enforcement folks and military folks now starting to go to legal states
I was just going to ask you about that.
to access treatment, but nobody knows. And so,
Right.
like for years, I've always talked with Rick and with Sarko is, man, I want an app that like all the providers have.
Right. Yeah.
That basically is, it assigns you an anonymous number. No one knows who it is. And that you can state, what are you? Are you a vet? Are you a paramedic? Are you a police officer? Are you an AUSA? Like, what is it?
Yeah.
Then
a triage app.
And then follow up and really see who is accessing treatment. I will tell you is, one of our LEAP folks, even though he's not on our masthead, but he does tons of work for us, is a guy by the name of Ethan Abend. And Ethan was and it's public because there's public videos on this at Reconsider website, is Ethan was blown up in a marijuana grow house in New York, that a battalion chief was killed. Him and his partner, they got sent out to an illicit grow house before cannabis. Remember back in the days when houses were blowing up in Colorado and other places?
Yes.
Right?
I do.
Anyway, house blows up. He gets severely injured. He tries to come back to work. He's got TBI. He's on all sorts of psychiatric meds, and he's suicidal. And he's about to kill himself, and he has a young kid. He's married, and he's being retired, and his pain is so much that he's like, I'm done. I'm going to kill myself. And instead, Ethan Googles psilocybin mushrooms. Like literally, like somewhere, someone he had read or something had come across, so he Googled it.
Yeah, he's in the fuck it, I'll try anything mode for sure. Right. Yeah,
exactly. And he finds a researcher that I'm not going to name from what university.
Yep.
And reaches out to some university researcher who puts him on a path to Texas, of all places. His TBI is so severe that he can't fly on a plane. He has to drive himself from New York to Texas, goes through his first weekend, does integration, before. He's got a service dog. He's like, it saved my life, but you have to work at it, right? He is one of those really, really smart, thoughtful, like he was a gung-ho narcotics type cop out there. And he says that he drives home from New York, and when he walked in the door, his little boy, and I'll never forget this, looked at him and said, "Daddy, your face looks softer," and just changed, saved his life, happily married, raising his son, and publicly puts himself out there to help other first responders in that same fashion. And so I think the beauty of LEAP, Sam, is that we don't judge our cops. Yes, we can hold people accountable, right? The same that I didn't
It's
judge.
an and, not an or.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just like my brother.
Yep.
Yes, he committed a crime. Yes, he was cooking methamphetamines for a biker gang back in the day. And that's what got him into that criminal justice system, right? It's like, let's deal with these issues. We can hold people accountable without having a system based solely on retribution, and get people into the systems of care that they need to save their lives. Make them better police officers to treat people's trauma. And, I always get asked this question, why vets? Why first responders? Why them? And I want to flip it back and say, is because, unfortunately, in a political system that stigmatizes people, we are putting folks out there that in many aspects have the ability to save or kill people: military, paramedics, firefighters, police officers. And we need them as healthy as possible. And if it works with people like them who have this trauma, it's going to work for everyone. So let's lift all boats by kicking the door in and getting law enforcement on the side of research and mental health and wellness and alternative medicines, they are less likely to stigmatize people who use drugs in their communities. They are more likely to have compassion and humanize each other. And I think that's the one thing that psychedelics does much differently than I think cannabis does, right? There's this real spirituality to psychedelic treatments, if you're open to it, that really increases the compassion that you have. And I think that the lack of compassion sometimes between cops and the community that they serve, and the community who doesn't trust the cops because of things that have happened in the past that I'm not
They've
saying.
both been traumatized. Both parties are traumatized, right?
Everybody's traumatized. And sometimes we gotta break that. And I think psychedelics has that real ability. And so it's only going to be the cops and the vets. It's like, no, we need, like, MDMA needs to be rescheduled, easily accessible, cheap, just like psilocybins do, and it also raises, you have the pharmaceutical fight between the natural plant medicine. I think we can exist in all of it. It's not an either or. And I see a lot of this, capitalism versus safe access for everyone. I think what we need to do, and what you've been doing so brilliantly, is like, how do we get Medicaid to pay for psychedelic treatment, right? How do we ensure that we have a healthcare system that provides the resources that people need in order to get the help that they need?
Yeah. Well, and that conjures a thought. I mean, at the state level, I'm glad you brought this up, because this gives me an opportunity to speak a little bit to what we're focusing on at the center. And then I do want to jump up at the federal level, because that's going to be a fun conversation too. But at the state level, from my perspective on where we're at right now, we've done some pretty historic stuff. We've proven that a state can set up a licensed and regulated program for anyone over the age of 21 that does not have contraindications to have what we were now able to say definitively safe access to psychedelic healing through psilocybin. And that's incredible. And I think that deserves to be celebrated, despite the other challenges that we still have to figure out, right? We weren't going to make it affordable or free on day one for everyone. Right. And that's just a reality. And that's the reality of politics and policy and the games that we have to play, right? And I also think that there's still a lot of really important advocacy points around efficacy and the case for psilocybin and psychedelics, but I'm starting to turn more towards the fiscal arguments for licensing, regulating, creating access, and making it affordable to various psychedelics, primarily psilocybin for now. I think there's a political incremental play to be had here, which I'm sure we'll get into when we start talking about the federal level. But I'm curious, actually, from the specific law enforcement perspective, have you delved into or talked with people that have looked at any of the economics as it relates to like cost savings for law enforcement officers? Because I've been thinking about the economics from like the state's perspective, and Medicaid patients, right? Which is one angle. But now I'm actually curious. I mean, you're the person to ask, like, has anyone done work on the fiscal savings that could be done just within law enforcement if they were to have some conservative level of access to legal psychedelics?
I think that there's two really interesting things here. No, it hasn't, right? No one is looking at, let's talk workman's comp issues, right? So I was retired on a workman's comp for a medical, right? And there's like this whole very complex process of the costs that it's costs associated both to the municipality and to the police officer itself. It's, incredibly complex. It's a very adversarial system. It's not about healing anyone. It's a fight over money. But you think about the costs associated with training, hiring, training, retention, job satisfaction, and efficiency and effectiveness of policing. Performance. Right? Nobody is looking at, like, you could simply look at a cost associated with workman's comp
Right.
service retirements that are psychological service retirements, right? And say, what did it cost to retire this officer? What did it cost us as an organization to train, retain? The cost of a career is millions of dollars, and we're just throwing it away because we're afraid to try this new novel breakthrough therapy. And so, you've been, for years talking about how the state level work is actually, and especially now, I think in this administration, is even more critically important. And we continue to see, Arizona had a trigger bill a few years ago that, if very specifically to the MDMA issue, if it would have been rescheduled, that they would have been able in the state of Arizona to use it for workman's comp purposes. Now, wouldn't it be great to be able to save a police officer's career rather than retire him at that point? There's a cost to municipalities, to retirement systems, to that individual itself. What's the cost associated to a family if you have a police officer that kills themselves?
Right.
So no, there has not. And yes, it should. And I think the place where you start it with is medical retirements associated with psychological retirements. It'd be a great place. Absolutely great place to start.
Well, and just such another incredible example of, again, like there's a lot of similar arguments for other, high intensity jobs, right? But the more I think about it, the more I talk about it, especially with you out loud, there's so many unique layers to law enforcement, especially on the fiscal and like cost savings side, that I think, I decided like 2 years ago, it's time to pivot towards the fiscal, because clearly we were in a cost cutting environment, making the case for states, or anyone really, primarily states, to invest in psychedelic healing. Ironically, has gotten harder, despite the fact that the trajectory of psychedelics and the conversation around psychedelics has actually broadened a lot, right? So it's a very interesting dynamic. But, when I think about what it actually takes, one, just to pass a law, and two, what you have to do to pass a psychedelic law, leaning into some of the things that psychedelic advocates do not consider like fun or interesting to talk about, actually may be the most important things for us to be leaning into right now, which is the line by line spend on what we are currently investing in various demographics, behavioral health. What does it cost and what is the outcome? And then let's put that next to what is psilocybin therapy cost and what is the outcome, right? And like, we can get really technical and clinical about it, but the truth is, legislators don't need a clinical trial 40 slide presentation. I'm sorry. Like, that's important. It helped us to get to where we are today. It's important that we continue to do that for a lot of different reasons. But when we're really truly talking about the audience that we need to convince, and we're asking them for money, just keeping it really short and brief to the basic question is what are we spending now, and what is the outcome, and what does it cost to do psilocybin therapy, and what is a conservative outcome? I think the side-by-side comparison will speak for itself. And I would think even more so, on magnitudes more, if we were able to figure out a vehicle to do that specifically within law enforcement costs.
Yes. And I'm talking, right, we just talked about law enforcement costs relative to workman's comp. Let's now talk about the costs associated with calls for service that are repeated calls for service for people who are engaging in social disorder because of trauma, whether it's mental health or substance use disorder. We did a really good job back in the day. The ACLU did that, like said, what's the average length of time, for a patrol officer who runs into, kids or someone who's got less than an ounce of marijuana out in the field, right? And what they figured out was, depending on like the situation, that it was like 2 hours of law enforcement time. And then they counted like, what's the record management time, booking into evidence, sending people to court. And so we were able to come up with a figure that said, if you decriminalize, if you regulate adult consumption, you do medical, there are costs associated that maybe the public doesn't understand, but it's about using those really expensive law enforcement resources to actually solve crime versus just turning people. What do you want your dollars of patrol time and calls for service? This is, we're exploring this right now because we're doing, we have a technical assistance program that does a community responder model where we go in and do technical assistance and we review calls for service and say, why are you sending a really super expensive armed cop to this type of situation? And the cost is we haven't figured out the cost yet, and it may not save a ton of money, but it frees up law enforcement time to concentrate on things that are more meaningful.
Even if it's revenue neutral from the economic perspective, there's some massive benefits on the other side, right? Like, yeah.
Exactly. And so I think that the count the cost is going to be so critically important because, I'll just talk about my MDMA experience, and I'm going back again. I've been very public about it. 2 years ago, I did, after years, and it cost me to fly to another state to engage, the hotel, the whole bit. It probably cost me personally $5,000, right? 3,000 being for integration, the day of, the medicine, all of it. And then the rest was travel. But you know what it did for me is like I sit there and I think about, oh my God, this was MDMA. Like I haven't done psilocybin and I don't know if I need to. Maybe, I don't know, right? It is that it allowed me to move past some significant ACEs trauma and law enforcement trauma. And it made me a better person. And so, like I'm not out there committing crimes, right? But from a count the cost perspective, if we priced these modalities and access through insurance and to look at our communities that are really marginalized, how can it benefit them? Because what we know is most crime is caused by people who've been traumatized or who have no other resources, right? There are people that are evil, don't get me wrong. I had my brother's girlfriend who was kidnapped by a serial killer back in 1984, and she lived. But, fiscal resources, $140,000 to incarcerate one person for a year in California Department of Corrections. In Massachusetts, that's $300,000 because their system's so much smaller. County jails in California is $50,000 if you're sentenced there for a year or you've been languishing for a year. There's a lot of costs that if we engaged in meaningful research and allowed safe access and stopped waiting for, we have to have this research in this pilot project. I think we have a lot of the research now. It's time to literally pull the trigger and implement and move past it.
Well, speaking of research and clinical trials, let's jump up to the federal level, which there's a lot of news going on. If you don't already know, I'm sure you probably do if you're listening to this podcast, about the Trump executive order that was recently signed. And I'm really curious, Diane, to hear your take on it as someone that has worked at every level of psychedelic policy and politics and drug policy reform in general, right? I'm really curious, at the federal level, this executive order, good or bad, or somewhere in between. What's your take? And maybe you could explain the executive order a little bit for folks too, if you feel comfortable doing that.
Sure. It's the executive order really was a order that basically said we are going to appropriate congressional funds to move towards the investigation of breakthrough therapies. And it was around ibogaine, but I think it covers things other than ibogaine, right? And so I think it's a massive marketing, great, but it's not going to, like, this is 3-4 years down the road. This is what people don't understand is this is, yes, this is fabulous. I'm so happy that we have this and that there's finally the discussion of the Controlled Substance Act, because I firmly am completely opposed to Schedule 1, because I can take every drug that's currently on Schedule 1 and say, no, there's medical benefits and there's research, and it may not be our own United States research, but outside the country, like heroin, right? Heroin assisted treatment programs exist outside our country that are very effective in enhancing community health and safety, every single drug. So I think it's a win for it's for us who've been talking about the failures of the drug war, because like the MDMA issue in 1985, how many people's lives would have been saved if we wouldn't have emergency scheduled MDMA? So what's the role of government? It should be, when it comes to drug policies, to reduce morbidity and mortality and save people's lives, and not just to turn people through a criminal justice system. So I think it's a win for us that it occurred. I'm being skeptical because people don't understand governance, because we can then go and talk about Measure 110. And the failures of why Measure 110 failed was because people didn't understand appropriations, right? And the way that the money gets rolled out to a system. And so then what this research has to go through is exactly what MDMA went through, clinical trials. And how many phases? What is it, 3 to 5 years before you even get to a phase 3 clinical trial? Sam, you know this a lot better than I do. Right? I'm just jokingly, I'm the dumb cop here.
Well, yeah, I mean, I do not purport to be a FDA clinical trial expert by any means, but my surface level understanding is that it takes many years. And of course, part of this is some, expedited process, right? I'm not an expert in the expedited vouchers that are included in this executive order, anything of that nature. I do generally agree that some people and some companies immediately benefited on the day of the executive order being signed.
Absolutely.
I was just researching really quick. I mean, Compass Pathways surged 42% the day. So for anyone saying like this is, just at, altruistic good of the movement, that might be, TBD. I'm also holding my breath and waiting for a second shoe to drop. If and when it does at some point. I do think it's interesting that it's elevated the conversation. I think it's interesting to see how it happened and the claims as to why it happened then. And look, this is one of the things that it's definitely one of the hot takes too. I mean, if psychedelics can prove that the federal government is going to be an effective vehicle for producing legal and safe access to psychedelics for those who stand to benefit, I'm all about it.
Right.
Like 100%. Right. And, the current trajectory is murky in that the current trajectory is looking a lot like big pharma, and I think there's still plenty of time. And there's been a lot of things and a lot of people have done incredible work at the federal level to really do our best to ensure that we are not repeating, copy and pasting every single mistake that we have learned from the big pharma model.
That's right.
It's very early and there's a lot of opportunity to get things better and right. And there's just as much opportunity, if not more, to fuck it up even more than we did with big pharma. So it's a big question mark. And in my mind, it is certainly dominating the press cycle right now, which is no surprise. Right. I find it fascinating that states are putting public dollars into clinical trials. And I'm not sure I understand why. Like, don't most of these clinical trials require the drug companies to push them through? And I guess we're going to see what happened in Texas recently, right? I mean, they couldn't get any drug developers for their iBegin initiative. And then the state said, we're going to do it ourselves. And so is the state of Texas going to become a drug company? How does that how does that work? There's a lot of questions, and that's just because I'm naive on the subject, right? So like I'm more than happy to be wrong and be proved wrong by people who know more than I do. But from the political process perspective, it is fascinating.
Yeah, and I think for me, what's interesting is I think their model, like how Texas is selling it, is like all the states can become part of the consortium and benefit financially by becoming their own kind of research and drug company. Maybe that's like at its basic level, because I'm a skeptic like you. Like there's two things. Let me tie in, and I kind of said it earlier, is I think that our national drug strategy right now is we are in full-blown cognitive dissonance and drug policy schizophrenia. So we have one is rescheduling cannabis. That is it going to happen? Supposedly it's going to happen.
But it hasn't happened yet. Let's make that clear for folks.
Yeah,
cannabis has not been rescheduled yet for anyone who thought that it was. That's a misnomer.
And I think that I'm viewing the psychedelic EO in the same fashion that it's like people, like ordinary Americans, don't understand the regulatory process and the difficulty and the complexities. So I'm going to segue a little bit into tobacco control and harm reduction, right?
Yeah. Yep.
There is in this whole issue going on around the illicit e-cigarette market with all the unregulated products coming in from China. Then, the kratom issue, they're talking about emergency scheduling, like
gas station drugs.
Yeah. Did you see the John Oliver?
I did, actually. I watched that last night.
It last night.
Incredible timing. I was wondering if we were going to talk about it. Yeah, really good.
It was really, really fascinating, because so much of this I blame on the FDA. So with the e-cigarettes, with the pre-market authorizations, as a comparison, the United Kingdom has something like 38,000 registered tobacco harm reduction products that are available to adult consumers there to help them quit smoking, because it's combustible nicotine. That's the issue, not nicotine itself.
Yeah. Right.
Take a guess how many have been authorized in the United States since 2020, when this whole mess started, when Trump 1.0 FDA banned disposable refillable e-cigarette pods. And the folks in China, this is drug displacement. This is drug policy, right? We ban something, and what happens? Somebody else develops a product. And so now we have this disposable e-cigarette market that is 69% illicit in the United States. 69% of our vaping market are unregulated and illicit tobacco products. We don't even have like I was doing a panel presentation, and I was with I will not name the agency, and I was on a panel. It's like, hey, I'm gonna go outside, and she pulls out an Elf or a Geek bar, and I'm like,
sure.
And from California, I'm like,
couldn't help yourself.
It's like, those are illegal in California. She's like, what do you mean? Right. And so it's the FDA, again, take a guess, 38,000 products UK to the United States. Tobacco harm reduction products, pouches, vapors. What do you guess? So how many?
You were outside, and this woman who worked for a certain agency pulled out she illegal vape product.
Yeah. So she was stunned. She had no idea.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
But
that's fun.
But guess how many products the FDA has authorized in a span of 5 years?
I'd honestly be surprised if it's more than zero.
It's 41. In comparison, 41 in comparison, and that they were supposed to, in these pre-market authorizations, had 180 days. And there are small businesses and big businesses that filed this massive regulatory process that costs, $500,000 to $1 million for one product, that have been sitting there for 5 years.
Right.
With no response from the FDA. So it's a failure of governance, right?
Sure.
And so everything is connected, like all drugs, and we can talk about the good drug versus bad drug, the exceptionalism that tends to be in
Sure.
in the world around the issue of psychedelics and cannabis. And let's start regulating based on risk and not on good drug versus bad drug. Because, like, this is my fourth cup of coffee today. Like, we are all drug users.
Yep.
And we have got to start acknowledging that there is no such thing as a drug-free America. I will even bet you that Kevin Sabet drinks coffee or tea or green tea or something that he does not look at himself as a drug user. If you take an aspirin, you're a drug user. If you take a prescription pill, you're a drug user. If you take off-label, Ozempic that you're now buying over the counter through companies that, hey, you don't need a prescription for it. We'll send you Ozempic. You just have to qualify under this. We are all drug users. Let's start acknowledging it. Let's blow up the Controlled Substance Act. Let's start scheduling, looking at risk and how to mitigate that risk to consumers. And we would save a whole lot of money. We wouldn't be involved in extrajudicial executions at high seas in South America and in other locations, right? It's, we all go back to count the cost. I want my local cops to go after people that are harming people, robbing people, killing them, raping them. Let's look at institutional legitimacy and how focusing on the wrong things actually undermines all our governance, all our institutions. I just wrote an article recently on the Epstein files and the Pam Bondi, and how that undermines the entire credibility of the criminal justice system. The pretty good shootings, how the federal response. And so I'm a skeptic. I will always look at the glass half full. I think we can use these executive orders, both for cannabis and for psychedelics, in a way to make it meaningful so we can explain to law enforcement, who tends to be pretty conservative, hey, we now recognize that neither cannabis or psychedelics should be Schedule 1. Let's have realistic conversations about this. Most cops, I had the fortune recently to talk to the president of one of the major Oregon Police Officers Association that shockingly surprised at what a reformer he is actually down. And we talked about the work LEAP had done in 2016 on the Proposition 64 campaign, and PORAC in particular in California poured money into the Kevin Sabet anti-campaign. Well, 2 years ago, under the Joyce States 2.0 rights bill, is CSPEAR got both PORAC and this Oregon Association to endorse the states' rights bill using the exact same language that LEAP has traditionally used for years. Whoa. So there's the impact. And so we were actually talking about something different. He called me relative to another bill that we had weighed in Oregon. And we had a real fruitful conversation, and he was honestly shocked. It's like, oh, I know who you are. And I mentioned the PORAC and his quote. He was like, right. Wow. I go, and then we had this whole discussion about reform and policy. And it goes back to the proper role of governance, but also the proper role of policing. Is I think most people don't understand that LEAP's role has been critically to align forward-thinking, innovative law enforcement voices who aren't afraid to say the truth. Right. And that's going to be continuing what we corral. Is where we're headed for the future is law enforcement. I predict that law enforcement and the mental health issue and the trauma is going to be what is going to get cops over the line. And the only cops are the real hard line. It's a generational issue too, right? It's a hard line narcotics officers associations that their bread and butter has been built for ages on stigmatizing people who use drugs. Right.
If there happen to be any active or retired law enforcement officers that end up listening to this, what would you want to say to them?
That policing is honestly the greatest thing I've ever done in my life. It has put me in positions to make not just policing better, but communities, and that we can all support each other, and that we as community members and as advocates recognize the real difficult job that law enforcement has, and that we can work together to create safety, not just for community members, but for cops and first responders themselves. Because if they don't feel safe to say, I need a break, safe to say, oh my God, I'm suffering from substance use disorder, safe to access these other breakthrough therapies, whether they're, medical marijuana, I look at like the RCMP right now. Do you want to know what the RCMP policy is in Canada relative to marijuana? When they federally legalized.
First tell me what it, what is the RMCP? What
does that say? Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Right?
Oh, okay, got it.
It's like their federal. Yes. It's like their federal police agency, right. Similar to the FBI, right. But they have a patrol side to them, right? And when Canada legalized federally, whether good or bad, capitalism, let's talk about on the ground. The leaders of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police said, we don't care if you use off duty, but you can't come to work and we're going to continue to drug test you. You can't use for 30 days. You know what their response is now? We don't care, but if you come to work intoxicated and we have to test you and you're positive, we're going to discipline you no different than if you were under the influence of alcohol, under the influence of opioids or anything else, right? It's like,
that's a reasonable policy.
It's a totally reasonable policy. And this is so, and this is a real concern for law enforcement leaders in the United States. Like the biggest question I get is, oh my God, if you legalize psychedelics for the use by my cops, what about flashbacks? We're still dealing with the LSD. People are going to have flashbacks. And then it's like, no, let's talk about, shelf life of drugs or half-life. This is how it really works. And, if people are going to use it for trauma treatment, they're going to go to a therapist who's going to put them through medical testing, which is exactly what I did. It's like I did more for my medical screening for my MDMA experience than I have in a long time. Like listing every supplemental that I use health-wise, any drugs, the whole bit, to ensure that I was going to be safe. Right. So, and MDMA is different than psilocybin. Psilocybin is safe. I mean, it's ridiculous that we continue. So education to the public, education to legislators, education. And then, I think we need to continue to discuss how to, the what about the kids argument, right? And, the whole anti-vaping issue right now, FDA, Dr. Markey, FDA scientists recently said these e-cigarette products should in fact be authorized. And Markey on his own said, nope, not going to happen. Just ignored the science and instead inserted his political ideology that favors attract kids to smoke these products, which the research goes completely against it. And so, I'm going to be doing a panel tomorrow in DC, and it's going to be talking about how we have to stop policymakers, their legislators or FDA officials, for using our children to create fear where we oppose science, research, and evidence-based policies, right? Is we need to practice harm reduction in every single thing that we do. How do we reduce the harms of trauma in policing? By opening up breakthrough therapies, by allowing people to use medical marijuana if they need to in a way so so they don't come to work impaired, right? I know cops who've been fired because they self-treated by using medical marijuana because they were so afraid to go to their department and say, I need help. So we have to change policy and law that allows people to be dehumanized and to have safe access.
Right. Well, and LEAP has so many incredible resources and connections with people with, at so many different levels. What's the best way if someone, is currently in law enforcement, formerly in law enforcement or adjacent, and they want to reach out to LEAP? What's the best way for them to get involved or to learn more? Actually, let's just start with the incremental. I'd like to learn more about, my concerns that may be, part of the stigma or maybe very real. I mean, there's a whole spectrum of them there. What's the best way for people to get in touch with LEAP?
So people can go to our website. There's an email that you can go to info only that, or an executive director that comes directly to me. And I answer pretty much unless it's spam. I answer every email. I just got one today, not from a cop, but from someone in Iowa who says, hey, I'm working in the cannabis space in Iowa and we have a chance to really change Iowa cannabis law. Can I meet with you? Right. So people can find me that. People can Google me, Diane Goldstein.
Sure.
It pops my cell phone number. I answer my cell phone number for everybody.
I will not put your cell phone number in the show notes, but I will put your email in there.
Yeah, but put my email in the show notes. I am happy to meet with folks. And, I'm starting to see a lot of, I just had a retired sergeant reach out to me who is a person in recovery who found us. And he may not agree with all our policies, but he sure wants to discuss officer health and wellness and how to elevate law enforcement voices so they're not afraid to ask for help. Because he was an alcoholic, he was suicidal, he walked away from the job, and there's lots of stories like this out there. And so and I think for your audience, I will broadly say this is, look, I'm not defending bad cops in any way, shape, or form. And I'm also not defending cops stigmatizing people who use drugs and recognize the harms that over-policing in our drug policy has caused. I recognize that George Floyd was murdered. I recognize that policing can be better. But if we can agree to be compassionate towards each other, it will make you who live in our communities safer, so you're not fearful of law enforcement. And it will make our cops safer, so they're not fearful of the people that we should serve as peace officers. And I think that's LEAP's goal. How do we elevate and uplift the healthiest and safest communities? And we can do it by ensuring that our cops are also safe and healthy.
Well said, Diane. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This has been an incredibly awesome podcast. It's been a long time since I've been able to talk to you for at least an hour. So if that is the only reason I started a podcast, that's good enough for me. But just really appreciate you and all of the work you have done over the years and everyone on the LEAP team, former and current. It's incredibly righteous work. It's incredibly hard. Again, we only scratched the surface on the amount of intersections that you stand in the middle of as it relates to all of this. That alone deserves so much applause. And I just really appreciate you taking the time to come on, and we're going to do everything we can to help promote this and LEAP as an organization. Between LEAP and SSDP, I don't know if we'd be here talking to each other.
Right.
So,
right. Like I think about two of the most impactful organizations going back to 2010 when I started doing the work. I love SSDP and always have. And, with that, Sam, I want to suggest is that if you need any other LEAP speakers to come on, get a hold of me. I'll put you in contact. And this work is hard, but it's so meaningful because probably some of the best relationships that I've really found in the last 15 years have been people who use drugs, people that are police officers who recognize that we're not perfect, people in policy, people who spent time in prison, who want to work to protect democracy in ways that we need in so many aspects. And I think we have things to be hopeful for, but the next couple of years are going to be tough. There's this big rollback to tough on crime. And I think that we need to push back against that and really ask, what does effective governance and policing look like? And what's the role of psychedelics in ensuring that we have the best policing and for our communities to help them deal with their trauma. Because I recognize that we've caused trauma to our communities, and then there's other policy trauma that's been caused that creates just these systems of inequality that need to be addressed.
Thank you, Diane.
No problem.
Really appreciate it. This has been incredible. All right. Well, I'll let you go.
Perfect.
And I'll make sure that check the show notes, folks. If you're interested in reaching out to LEAP or supporting LEAP, we'll provide both contact information, especially if you want to throw them a couple of dollars. They are a nonprofit doing this incredible work, and none of it gets done for out of the goodness of their heart. Although many of them have been doing out of the goodness of their heart for a long time, regardless of that. So totally worthy of your time and consideration and money if you have any to throw their way. I highly encourage you to do that. All right. Thanks, Diane. I'll talk to you soon.
Perfect. And then edit this out. Send us the link, and I'll have my social media team put it out everywhere. We'll put it on LinkedIn.